Hi, this is Mark Bowser, and welcome to another Mark Bowser Reads video series. This is part 2 of our Some Gave It All story that we're reading. This is the book that Danny Lane and myself wrote about Danny's experience as a combat Marine in Southeast Asia. For those of you who are reading along in your copy, we are starting on page 17. The sound was deafening in its silence. It's not that he was alone. There were many people within a few feet of him. There were even massive, multi-propelled helicopters in the near distance, being prepared for liftoff. But it was the loneliness of his thoughts. What have I gotten myself into? Thought 19-year-old Danny Lane. Just 2 days ago, he was stateside, and now he was in Vietnam. He adjusted his helmet to sit more snugly over his short brown hair. It was November 20, 1968, and Danny and his fellow Marines sat on the cold, wet tarmac in full combat gear. It was 4 a.m., and it was cool. It was not only cool, but it was wet. The monsoon season was in full swing. During this period, rainfall averaged an inch a day, an everlasting reality that Danny would soon learn to ignore. But on this given day, and at this given moment, he was an inexperienced boot. You could tell a boot apart from everyone else. For one thing, their green, camouflaged, perfectly creased uniforms and shiny boots looked like they had just come off a store shelf. Danny couldn't even be called a grunt yet. A grunt was a new soldier who had at least seen combat. A grunt was given a little bit of respect. But just a little. A boot? None. No one wanted to be next to a boot. Boots were untested, and no one wanted to be next to them when the bullets started flying. The helicopters fired up their engines, and the Marines started moving slowly across the dimly lit tarmac towards the choppers. It was raining pretty hard now, and Danny could hardly see where he was going. Right beside him walked his best friend, Soter Karras, who was also 19 years old. Soter was small in stature, but large in heart. He had tremendous courage and always had a smile on his face. Danny and Soter had met in boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina, and had become fast friends. Soter became known as the Greek because he always carried the Greek flag with him, which he planted in the moist Vietnamese ground in the heat of battle. Soter was the son of Greek immigrants and still held citizenship in Greece. He had only been an American citizen a short time before he joined the Marine Corps. On this very early morning in Southeast Asia, Danny and Soter each wore 100-pound backpacks, which were getting heavier by the minute because of the soaking rain. Danny and Soter climbed aboard one of the helicopters along with the rest of their squad. In all, there were 13 of them, 12 Marines, and their squad leader, Corporal Kessler. Kessler was a slim man with a harshness in his features that reminded one of a constipated pit bull. He had what was known as a 1,000-yard stare, and there was no doubt that he was in charge. In his 9 months in the country, Kessler had seen his share of action and had survived many battles. The big bird lifted off and joined the formation of choppers headed toward the war zone. Operation Meade River was about to commence. It was to become the largest helicopter assault of the entire war. 5,000 Marines were involved in the operation. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong had embedded themselves in a place of the Americans called Dodge City, known for the shoot-'em-up gunslinger style of fighting that took place there. As Danny and Soter tried to collect their courage, one of the experienced gunners looked at them and said, "You boots had better sit your butts on your helmets." "Why?" asked a bewildered Soter. "Because bullets can come up right through this flimsy piece of crap we call a helicopter hull and go straight up your..." Danny and Soter immediately jerked their helmets off their heads and perched upon them. The battle-hardened Marine who had given the boys the sage advice shook his head with a knowing smile and muttered, "Boots. You can't live with them, and we aren't supposed to shoot them." He and all the other experienced Marines on board roared in laughter. Danny glanced uneasily at Soter. They were beginning to hate this place already. They had been flying for what seemed forever, even though Dodge City was only a short 20 miles away. The unknown can be a very scary place, but flying into it while knowing the worst is yet to come can be downright terrifying. Time seemed to slow to a crawl on board that helicopter, at least for Danny and Soter. Not so far below, the battle had already begun. Explosions and gunfire rocked the ground. As their helicopter began its descent toward the landing zone, or LZ, an explosion was heard and immediately the helicopter shuddered. Danny and Soter looked nervously at each other. What had happened? They didn't have to wait long for the answer. "Chopper up front is hit! She is going down!" the pilot screamed. An enemy rocket had just penetrated the hull of the helicopter directly in front of theirs. The chopper hit the jungle canopy below and burst into flames. Death hovered above the crash. How many Marines had just been snuffed out? Danny didn't know at the time. A whole squad for sure, maybe more. "We're drawing fire," the gunner screamed. "Hold on to something." As bullets riddled the hull of the helicopter, Danny quickly grabbed hold of a hand brace attached to the left side of the craft. The pilot banked sharply left and accelerated to full throttle in an attempt to get out of the kill zone. Soter lost his balance and fell off his helmet. He quickly sat upon it and hung on with everything he had in him. As all this was going on, the helicopter gunner began firing his huge M60 machine gun out of the gun port, an opening near the front of the aircraft. Danny and Soter's knuckles were snow white from the death grip they each had on their respective hand grips inside the Boeing Vertol CH-46 C-9 helicopter. The helicopter was being buffeted from all sides like an abandoned leaf in a hailstorm on a midsummer eve. But this was no summer storm. This was the Viet Cong raining gunfire upon them. Looking out the tiny windows of the CH-46, Danny and Soter saw explosions not so far below. The sound of the gunfire in their eyes was petrifying. Danny glanced over at Soter. His face said it all. Pure terror. The same face Danny knew he wore if he could only see himself in a mirror. The CH-46 banked hard again, this time to the right, and sped away from the hostile fire. They had traveled a few hundred yards in a matter of seconds. The door gunner looked back at the Marines and yelled, "Get ready to disembark!" With that, all the Marines got to their feet. Danny and Soter followed suit. Just then, the aircraft was rocked again from the bombardment of gunfire. As the ramp at the rear of the helicopter, at the rear of the chopper opened, the door gunner yelled, "Jump! Now! Get out! Now!" As the Marines launched themselves out of the helicopter, the door gunner started raining his own fire down again on the enemy position. Bursts of light filled the air. Some of it was from the rear gunner's own tracer bullets. Much of it was from the enemy's ammunition, which was now riddling the hull of the American helicopter. Not knowing how high the helicopter was off the ground, Danny somehow managed to muster up the courage to leap into the unknown air. He figured it had to be safer on the ground. At least, he hoped it was. He jumped into the dead of night and into the seeking grip of the enemy. It seemed like forever before Danny hit the ground. When he finally did, he hit hard. His body shuddered from the shock of the impact as he rolled over onto his side. He slowly began to get to his feet as Soter landed right behind him. They were greeted with more hostile fire, and they immediately scuttled off into the cover of the dark jungle. Foliage bristled under the assault as they ran and dove into the brush. Welcome to Vietnam. That's where we're going to end today. Now, as you can imagine, that was a shock for our two 19-year-olds. Just a day or two before, they were in the States. Now they were being shot at by the Viet Cong. Join me next time as we find out what happens to Danny and Soter alone in the jungle. This is Mark Bowser. Thanks for listening.